A court in Belarus has sentenced Nobel Peace Prize laureate and human rights activist Ales Bialyatsky to 10 years in prison. Unions vent their anger in Athens after the worst train accident in Greece's history, which has killed dozens of people.
Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are now practically surrounded, so says the head of Russia's Wagner group, calling on Ukraine to allow those left to leave.
Greek MEP Eva Kaili will remain in custody for a further 2 months, says a Belgian court.
A court in Belarus has sentenced Nobel Peace Prize laureate and human rights activist Ales Bialyatsky to 10 years in prison. He was found guilty of financing actions violating public order and smuggling. 3 other men who worked with Bialyatsky in the Vyazna Human Rights Center he founded were also given multiple-year sentences. Bialyatsky has received several international awards for his fight for human rights. The main leader of the Belarusian opposition in exile, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, called this sentence a shameful injustice. Since disputed elections in 2020, President Alexander Lukashenko has unleashed a brutal crackdown on opposition, arresting thousands. Unions have vented their anger in Athens, demonstrating outside the headquarters of the country's rail operator after the worst train accident in Greece's history, which killed dozens of people. They blame poor working conditions and a failure to modernize the network as being partially responsible in leading to the disaster. A new 24-hour strike has been called for Friday. Relatives of the victims are furious over the lack of information.
4 φορές καταγράψα το όνομά μου και ακόμα δεν έχει πάρει κανείς τηλέφωνο πίσω. Προφανώς οι δικοί μου άνθρωποι είναι και 2 νεκροί αυτή τη στιγμή. Έχω χάσει τον αδελφό μου, έχω χάσει τον πατέρα μου. Δεν μπορεί να αλλάξει κάτι σε αυτό, το γνωρίζω. Σας το
Rescue operations are still underway under difficult circumstances, with the focus now being on the 3rd carriage that is almost completely overturned. According to the Greek fire service, 56 people are still missing. The search is expected to conclude on Friday.
Ukrainian soldiers around Bakhmut at the epicenter of the fighting in the east. But 2 weeks on from when these images were filmed, their position is increasingly precarious, as is that of the few remaining civilians. On Friday, the Russian mercenary group Wagner claimed to have practically surrounded the strategically important city after a battle lasting months. Russian forces have now cut off most Ukrainian supply routes. Wagner's founder, infamously referred to as Putin's chef, called on Ukraine's president to give his troops a chance to leave. Only one road remains, he said. The pincers are closing in. The Ukrainian president, who on Friday visited wounded soldiers in a hospital in Lviv, has previously declared that Ukrainian troops will defend Bakhmut as long as possible. Meanwhile, on Ukraine's northeastern front, the army has ordered the mandatory evacuation of several areas around Kupiansk.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has again defended his country's invasion of Ukraine to the international community at a G20 forum in India. When pressed on how he sees the war ending, Lavrov complained that the G20 group was dominated by the West's view on the war in Ukraine.
When Russia has, after many years of warnings, started to defend itself, there is nothing except Ukraine which is of interest for G20. It's a shame.
Away from the forum, Beijing appeared to take a similar line, that the G20 should not discuss the war.
中方在乌克兰问题上的立场是一贯的，没有变化。20国集团是国际经济合作的主要论坛，各成员国领导人在去年的巴厘岛峰会宣言中明确宣布，20国集团不是解决安全问题的论坛。扩充核武库。
The West fears China may move beyond diplomatic support for the Kremlin and support Russia with weapons. But Beijing denies these claims.
The EU's decision to ban the sale of internal combustion engines for cars and vans by 2035 is for now on hold, after member states postponed a crucial vote on the issue Friday. At least 4 countries, including Germany, Italy, Poland and Bulgaria, are among those who expressed their concerns. Berlin is campaigning for an opt-out for cars that run on e-fuels and has asked the European Commission to change the legislation.
We want to understand those concerns better, in particular the new concerns, before deciding on what's the best way to proceed and how they can be met.
The move to ban combustion engine cars by 2035 is a landmark measure for the EU, as it looks to become climate neutral by the middle of the century. The European Parliament approved the law last month, but with a tight margin. The legislation was then passed on to member states for the final green light, and it's here where the debate has been reopened. The law proposes that all new vehicles sold across the EU market from 2035 onwards should have a 100% reduction in CO2 emissions, which means all cars that run on petrol and diesel.
A Belgian court has decided to extend Greek Social Democrat Eva Kaili's pre-trial detention by 2 months. Kaili was arrested in December and appeared before a Brussels Court of Appeal on Tuesday to request her release with an electronic bracelet. The former Vice President of the European Parliament is charged with criminal organisation, corruption and money laundering in a bribery scheme linked to Morocco and Qatar. Belgian Socialist MEP Mark Tarabella, who is accused of the same crimes as Kaili and has been in jail since February, will also remain in custody.
Moldova's lawmakers voted on a draft project which aims to replace the Moldovan language with the Romanian language in law texts, including in its constitution. The project obtained a majority with 56 votes. The decision sparked uproar among deputies of the bloc of communists and socialists. The ruling honours a 2013 Chizanu court decision, which decided that the text of the Declaration of Independence takes precedence over the constitution. In the Declaration of Independence, the state language is Romanian.
Leaders are discussing the multiple threats the world seas face in Panama at the Our Oceans conference. About 600 business people, environmental activists and academics are expected to rub shoulders at the 2-day gathering in the Central American country. Oceans are coming under increased stress, not just from climate change, but also from pollution, overfishing and mining. Covering 3/4 of the Earth, the oceans are home to 80% of all life on the planet, providing nourishment for more than 3 billion people.
1 year ago, the European Union opened its doors to Ukrainians fleeing Russia's invasion by activating this so-called Temporary Protection Directive. It was an unprecedented decision that enabled as many as 4 million people to stay in the EU until March 2024. Nearly 12 months later, and the European Commissioner for Home Affairs tells Euronews that the EU did well to manage, after showing her extracts from our reporting on the ground.
Мати спокій, бо мені постійно приходиться якісь робити папіри, які то закінчуються, то кінець року, і я не маю ніякого спокою, щоб займатися навчанням та вихованням доньки.
So basically, what can be done, in your opinion, to fasten these procedures that the refugees are facing?
Well, of course, we have a lot of challenges. I mean, we are hosting 4 million Ukrainian refugees. This is really a huge, huge challenge, of course, for the whole Europe, and especially for those member states that are most affected, like Czech Republic, Estonia, Poland, but also Germany. But I think really to have a perspective, if somebody has asked me 1 year ago, before the war broke up, will Europe be able to manage 4 million new refugees as well as we have done this? I think very few should have been asked positively without any hesitation. So taking into account the huge challenges, I think that the achievements are really great.
Other issues of concerns seem to be housing and work for Ukrainian refugees, as we can see in the next video.
Migrants are more or less adapted, right? But now there is an issue of their access to labor market, massive problem of apartments. This is the time that we need to think of more long-term strategy.
But I think this interview really shows where we are right now. We are moved away from the emergency situation and are now into dealing with other issues. We have already more than 600,000 Ukrainians working. We have another like 400,000 that are registered in the public employment service. So that means that approximately half of the refugees in working age are more or less on the labor market. That's not so bad, but of course we need to do more. We have 750,000 children in our schools, but what was also mentioned here, housing, of course, is a challenge in many regions and towns.
Do you think that this instrument, this temporary protection directive, could be used again in other cases in the future?
Yes, I think so. I think it has proven that it works. I mean, just imagine if you compare to 2015, for example, where people were fleeing from the war in Syria, and the EU did not activate the temporary protection directive that existed already then but was not activated. And that left us also in a situation where we were very much divided on the issue on migration and refugees and asylum. And a lot of asylum systems were really clogged up with a lot of asylum applications. There were long waiting times. Now, of course, there are challenges. I will not deny that. But I think we are dealing with this refugee crisis in a much better way. Maybe it's not even a crisis, even though it's the biggest number of refugees since the Second World War.